Welcome everybody. Today we'll be hearing from Andrea Zuvich. Andrea is a 17th century historian specialising in the House of Stuart, as well as being an historical advisor and author of historical fiction. Sex and Sexuality in Stuart Britain is Andrea's sixth book and covers etiquette, courtship, dress and morals, or lack of, in the Stuart age. This event is free. I would, however, ask that you'd consider purchasing a copy of Andrea's book and making a small donation to the Wantage Literary Festival. Details on how to donate or to purchase one of Andrea's books can be found on our social media pages. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the talk. This event is being recorded and will be made available to all at a later date via YouTube. Over to you, Andrea.
Hello, thank you, Vicky, and thank you to the Wantage Literary Festival for having me here today. And hello, everyone, for joining us. We will be having a look at Stuart Sex and Sexuality, and then we'll be following this by a Q&A. It may surprise you how wide-ranging the effects of sex and sexuality were, but they impacted and continue to impact much more than we may think. Besides actual sexual acts, sexual preferences, contraception, conception, and childbirth, among other things directly related to sex, sex and sexuality can be seen in a multitude of other things. Before we start our overview of Stuart-era sexuality, let's cover a few basics, shall we? What was Stuart Britain? Well, whilst the Stuarts as a Scottish monarchy certainly stretched back to the 1300s, Stuart Britain is the name most historians use for the time spanning 1603 to 1714. 1603 was, as you may know, the year in which Queen Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors, died. She died unmarried and childless. Over 100 years later, in 1714, the Protestant Stuart line ended with the death of Queen Anne, who, despite having been married for 25 years and having had between 16 and 18 pregnancies, had no surviving children. And so you see, two great dynasties ended with queens who had no heirs with whom to continue their royal lines. One question many historians are asked regularly is, why do you write mainly for the rich and privileged few? In my article for the BBC History Extra, Stuart Britain, What Was Life Like for Ordinary People, I stated that one answer is that there is generally much more information available to historians about this select group of people than there is about anyone else. And the reason for this is that the wealthy were more likely to be educated, or at least at least educated enough so that they could read and write, and therefore we have surviving written accounts from them. Meanwhile, the so-called common people, although no less interesting, were largely illiterate during this period, so their stories tended to be shared orally and sadly have been lost over time. Nevertheless, we have been able to determine some of the features about the lives of everyday people who lived, worked, loved, and died in Stuart Britain. We have court records and legal documents such as indentures and lawsuits, baptismal registries, and the newspapers of the day. We also have the fascinating bills of mortality, which list all the perceived causes of death during a given period. Now, the Stuart era man and woman, they were generally smaller and shorter than we are today. This said, certain members of the Royal Stuarts were known for their tallness of height, such as Charles II, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and Queen Mary II, for example. Now we're going to get into some more information about what they called their private areas. The male sex organ, the penis, was also referred to as a yard, a prick, a pillycock, a cock, a phallus, a staff of love, a dandilolly, among other things. Circumcision was not a cultural norm at this time, and the foreskin was generally left alone. As for women, various terms were used to refer to the female genitals, including the colloquial tuzzy-muzzy, cunnyburrow, flapdoodle, quim, garden of delight, cut, and commodity. Now, menstruation, which was often referred to as the terms or flowers, was treated as a sort of strange or mysterious aspect of womanhood. The definition of menstruous in the English Dictionary of 1623 states that it is having her sickness, foul, filthy. So that gives us a pretty clear idea of how it was regarded during the time. As for personal hygiene, well, that wasn't particularly high on the Stuart agenda. And parasites such as fleas, lice, and even intestinal worms plagued many people in every social class in Stuart Britain. Sexual contact would allow parasites to infect a new host, and during this time, people suffered from pubic lice infestations. As with head lice, pubic lice could be eliminated, at least temporarily, by removing the hair, usually by shaving. And there are some examples of artwork of the period depicting scenes in which a mother combs her child's hair in order to remove the nits. And this would have been a very commonplace scene in the everyday fight against lice. Next up, we have something that I quite like. I quite like makeup. I don't know about you. God hath given you one face, and you make yourselves another. This, from William Shakespeare's Hamlet, which was written circa 1600 to 1601, is, I feel, the perfect quote for our next subject, makeup. Now, makeup was usually referred to as paint, and it was a controversial topic during the Stuart period because it was so often associated with wanton women, or indeed prostitutes. Makeup has been used throughout history in order to help attract a potential spouse or lover. And some people in the Stuart period regarded this unfavorably. The diarist, John Evelyn, lamented this growing trend in his entry from May 1654, excuse me. I now observed that the women began to paint themselves, formerly a most ignominious thing, and used only by prostitutes. This sentiment is also expressed in a late Stuart era song, A Hue and Cry After Beauty and Virtue. And in this, they say, whoring and painting flourish so well, we hardly know where honest women dwell. Makeup, as we can gather, was seen as a kind of falsehood. And John Evelyn was not alone in this dislike of makeup. An unnamed gentleman whose letter appeared in the 17th of April, 1712 edition of The Spectator went further. He said, there are women who do not let their husbands see their faces till they are married. I mean plainly that part of the sex who paint. Now, this fellow was taken in by his wife's good looks, but upon seeing her true makeup-free face the morning after their wedding, he declared, she scarce seems young enough to be the mother of her whom I carried to bed the night before. Pretty harsh. And as an aside, makeup, cosmetics often contain toxic ingredients, which sometimes prove to be fatal. That said, Stuart people were exposed to toxins on a regular basis, too, with things such as pewter, which contained lead. Now, within the domestic sphere, there were clearly defined roles for the sexes. And sexual inequality was generally regarded as perfectly natural. Women were bound to obey their fathers and brothers, and then their husbands, and then their sons. In his Advice to a Daughter from 1688, George Savile, 1st Marquess of Halifax, wrote, "There is inequality in sexes, and that for the better economy of the world, the men, who were to be the lawgivers, and the larger share of reason bestowed upon them, you have more strength in your looks than we have in our laws, and more power in your tears than we have by our arguments." Now, we're going to have a brief look at prostitution in Stuart Britain. I'm going to read an excerpt from my book. These pages 38 and 39. Here we go. Men or women who ran brothels or bawdy houses were known as bawds, and in an act for suppressing the detestable sins of incest, adultery, and fornication from 1650, anyone fitting this description was regarded as guilty of a secondary offence felony. The punishment for this was for the bawd to be whipped in public, then placed in a pillory, where they would then have the letter B for bawd branded into their forehead with a hot iron. The bawd would then be sent to prison for 3 years without bail. If upon release they reoffended, they would then be executed. Now, one of the most successful prostitutes and brothel keepers was one Damaris Page, who lived from 1610 to 1669. And she was so well known that Page was even mentioned by Samuel Pepys in his diary. In The Life and Death of Damaris Page, that great arch-metropolitan old woman of Ratcliffe Highway, published by Burton, London, in 1669, "Death on her house of clay at last did seize, and sacked the same worse than the prentices. There many a seaman hath sat with his doxy, and spent his coin till he grew foxy, poxy." Now, of course, poxy is referring to venereal disease of especially syphilis, which was quite common in these establishments. Now, one of Page's contemporaries and fellow madams was Elizabeth Cresswell, referred to in the 19th century as a celebrated English procuress. During the reign of Charles II, it is likely that Cresswell began her career as a prostitute in the 1650s before working her way up to the status of bawd. In the bawdy house riots of 1668, female prostitutes and their brothels were subjected to attacks from mainly young men who proceeded to vandalize and destroy their properties. The Poor Whores Petition, published in March of that year, was a petition addressed to Barbara Palmer, Lady Castlemaine, on behalf of her poorer sister prostitutes. Now, for those who don't know, Barbara Palmer was Charles II's mistress. She was quite powerful at this time, and she took this quite badly, unexpectedly. Both the aforementioned Damaris Page and Elizabeth Cresswell were listed as signatories at the bottom of the Poor Whores Petition. Now, there were other establishments, and some of the most popular ones were Holland's Leger, which was run by Elizabeth Holland, and it was in the heavily Dutch-populated Paris Garden, Bankside. And another one was quite an infamous bawd called Pris Fotheringham, and she lived from circa 1615 to 1668, and she was listed in Garfield's The Wandering Whore as Pris Fotheringham at the Chuck office. Now, this is quite a story. This was a reference to Fotheringham's popular trick of standing on her head, her legs spread open, to show off her genitals, at which point her spectators would literally chuck coins at her and she would catch them with her vulva. So that's quite quite a parlor trick, I suppose. So that was quite something to learn about. Now, hope you enjoyed that. Let's see, I'm going to share something right now. Share my screen. Just bear with me, please. There we are. And there's a cover of my book. And these are some of the questions that I answer in the book. And it is quite interesting to see that there are so many differences between what people thought were sexually attractive during the Stuart period and things that they thought were sexually deviant, and also how old people were when they were married. There is this common misconception that people married very young during this time, and in most of the literature of the time, there was this feeling, this general sentiment of you shouldn't marry too young. You should be at least 18. You should really be in your 20s. And most people married in their mid to late 20s. And of course, some royals were married in politically advantageous matches, but we can't consider that as a norm for the time. Even Charles I, he told his sister Minette in the letter that he was going to have his son, the Duke of Monmouth, marry Anna Scott, and they weren't going to be able to consummate the marriage because they were both too young. And this is generally what most people in Stuart Britain believed. So there we go. All right, let's see. Bear with me, please. That's my mouse has stopped working. Let's see. Sorry about that. I'm trying to get my mouse back. There we go. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. Some technical difficulty, but this is the new world we're working with, so we have to learn as we go. So this is a very good depiction of premarital sex, which was frowned upon during this period. And this is a work, an engraving by Bernard Picot, entitled Young Couple Caught by Parents, and this is from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Now, during the Stuart period, marriage was considered a sacred gift from God, a union of two sexes, man and woman, for God ordained that because it was not good that the man should be alone, gave him a helpmeet, and commanded them both to increase and multiply, and imprinted in them an eager desire to unite themselves together for the propagation of their species. That was the general belief during this time. It was through marriage that a man could obtain levement, a comfort which only a wife can provide. Now, Stuart era marriage was a very serious business. not to be entered upon lightly. I have in my own archives a legal document from 1683, which covers the marriage portion of an Englishwoman named Eleanor Denton to William Blisbury in Lincolnshire. Now, this was an age in which women came to a marriage with a portion or dowry, and that would be money, property, or other assets. The more bountiful a dowry, the likelier a woman would be to secure an advantageous match. A jointure would be whatever a bride brought to her marriage that could be used to sustain her should she survive her husband. This said, marrying solely for money was discouraged. Although there were many practical considerations to be had before marriage, we must not think that Stuart-era peoples were always rational. From John Ray's A Collection of English Proverbs from 1670, "He who marrieth for wealth doth sell his liberty. Who marrieth for love without money hath good nights and sorry days." People sometimes fell in love and rashly married, only to find themselves impoverished. And that's something to remember about this time period. Most people were quite poor, and it was a struggle. Life was a struggle. And when you think about huge upheavals that took place during this time, particularly the British Civil Wars, popularly referred to as the English Civil Wars, this was a huge upheaval. Many people faced famine, warfare, and a whole plethora of horrible things. So that's that. As for divorce, this was extremely rare during the Stuart period and was usually only granted via a private act of parliament. Divorce only became more common in Britain following the Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. So quite a deal after. I think most of us, I certainly have, I'm sure you have as well, have had a broken heart in their time. Well, what did a Stuart person do with such a situation? Well, the Ladies' Dictionary of 1694 provided several recommendations, and some of them include: exercise yourself in walking or running, do it vigorously, and the burning flames of hell. Nope, the burning flames of love, which could be interpreted as hell for some, may expire or much abate of their vehemency. I personally know of at least 2 people who took up power walking or running after a relationship came to an end. So there is a continuity there between the Stuart era and our own in terms of advice after a relationship has ended. Another tip was to change one's diet, since it was believed that just as some foods had aphrodisiacal properties, others had the opposite effect. And the Stuart period quite believed in the humoral system, going back to Galen and the ancients. And so they thought some things were phlegmatic, it's cold or wet, and there's a whole list of things that I've included in the book that will make that more, that will clear that up. But that's something they thought about. And so foods could have an opposite effect to what they were feeling. And it's quite a fascinating thing. Some people, of course, had sexual proclivities that were regarded as deviant. These included those who had sexual relations with their own sex, also known as sodomy between men and, well, I should mention that the words lesbian and homosexual were not used in Stuart Britain. They came into use during the 19th century. Instead, terms used during the period were mainly sodomite or catamite for men involved in male-to-male sexual activity, and tribad for women engaged in female sexual activity. Now, cross-dressing was another area looked upon as deviant. Charles II's own first cousin, Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, who was the younger brother of Louis XIV or Louis XIV of France, was known not only for his male lovers, but for his flamboyant cross-dressing. Louis turned a blind eye to this behavior due to fraternal love, probably, despite being personally repulsed by it. Occasionally, however, cross-dressing could serve as a useful and life-saving disguise. When King James II and VII was a 14-year-old Duke of York under house arrest in St. James's Palace, in order to escape his captivity, he wore a woman's habit and successfully fled England for Holland. Similarly, James's youngest sister, Henrietta Anna, also known as Minette, was smuggled out of England dressed as a boy. But she did not like this scheme, and her indignant protestations that she was actually a princess nearly gave her away. Another part of the Stuart scene was witchcraft. Now, many people associate witchcraft with the Stuart period, and with examples such as the Salem witch trials of 1692, the Belvoir witches, the Pendle witches, among many others. It's no wonder that this is the case. Perhaps surprisingly, this is yet another aspect of life in Stuart Britain that had great sexual connotations. And so now I'll read page 63 from my book. Page 62. There is a strong element of sexuality in Stuart-era notions of witchcraft. The incubuses also serve to satisfy the lust of the witches, and the succubuses the lust of the wizards. Succubi were female demons who would target sleeping men in order to have sex with them. Incubi, on the other hand, were male demons who would do the same, but with women. Strangely enough, one of the most active witch hunters of the Stuart period was the king himself. King James was profoundly interested in a wide variety of supernatural topics, especially witchcraft, and his interest intensified shortly before becoming King of England. He is credited with writing the book Demonology. Let's see, is everyone still there? Right. Okay. He is credited with writing the book Demonology from 1597, which covered topics such as necromancy, witchcraft, and specters. In this, he stated that supernatural entities steal the sperm of a dead body, and that this sperm, being used on a living victim, seems intolerably cold. Now, this idea of cold ejaculate and a cold body would be mentioned later by some accused of witchcraft, notably in the trial of Susanna Edwards in 1682. Susanna Edwards to confess that she was sucked in her breast several times by the devil in the shape of a boy lying in her bed, and that it was very cold unto her, and further saith that after she was sucked by him, the said boy or devil had the carnal knowledge of her body for several times. All right. I will try to get this back up. Do bear with me, please. Right, here we go. My book, Sex and Sexuality in Britain, is divided into two parts. The first is a macro view of the wide-ranging topics, some of which we've just covered. And the second half is a closer look at the individual Stuart monarchs. Now, first, however, I would like to have a brief talk about sex toys. So those unfamiliar with the history of sex toys may assume them to be a modern concept. In fact, not only were they available and in use during the Stuart period, but they date to ancient times. And John Wilmot, 2nd Earl of Rochester's poem Signor Dildo was written around 1673, and it is a bawdy poem about dildos and about how much women love to use them. Women without dildos resorted to masturbation with other objects, claimed Rochester, such as a candle, carrot, or thumb. Dildos were also depicted on the frontispiece of both 1683 editions of The School of Venus, which is pictured here in front of us, and L'Académie des Dames. In both artworks, the sex toys are seen hanging from stalls and displayed upon tables, where they are carefully inspected by potential lady customers. All right, now we're going to get into another section known, and I like to call them the sexy Stuarts. Let's have a bit of fun, yeah. Here we go. We have King James VI of Scotland, who was King James I of England. James VI and First was the only child of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. The speculation over James's sexuality has long been discussed, even in his own time. After all, a popular saying was, "Elizabeth was king, now James is queen." It is true that throughout his lifetime he gravitated towards young, handsome men. There were three men famously associated with James: Esme Stuart, Robert Carr, and George Villiers. It was the latter who was, I'd argue, James's great love. Yes, James did write publicly against sodomy, but the private letters between James and Villiers were of a kind that made me think, and it really convinced me, that they had a homosexual relationship. But it's always very difficult to tell this sort of thing for past figures, and I'm always reluctant to label them using modern sexual terms, because it really was a different world, and I just don't think it's right to do that. But based on the letters, I would say that he would have been, probably, if we have to label him at all, probably more bisexual in nature, because he was able to have sexual relations with his wife, Princess Anna of Denmark, and they had many children together. And so there's that. But there is another part of early modern writing and letters in general. They were much more sentimental and effusive and flowery, and there was a lot more of this this conveying the sense of love and from one person to another. And it didn't always have a sexual meaning. And so it's very hard to judge, but based on the kind of content in the letters, that convinced me that they had possibly a sexual relationship. But again, it's hard to ever say categorically one way or another, but that's what I think. Now, James died in 1625, and Villiers by then had become a very, very powerful man, and many people had grown to hate him. He was eventually not executed. Many people wanted to execute him, but he was eventually assassinated in 1628. And that was the end of him. Let's see. His second son, his first son was Henry Stuart, and he was the Prince of Wales, but he died aged 18 in 1612. His spare, which is a terrible thing to say, but that's generally what they're regarded as, was Charles, and Charles reigned from 1625 to 1649. And for those of you who aren't acquainted with his story, he had a very volatile reign, which ended in his execution. And Charles I was very different from his father. Although beautiful women such as Lucy Hay were thrust in front of him in the hopes that they could become his mistress, he wasn't interested in that kind of lifestyle. His father's court had been known, rather infamously, for having a sort of debauched carry-on, where things were where bad language was bandied about, and there was a general licentious nature to it. And he wanted to do things very differently to his father. And so it was a very formal court, and he was very different. And so was his brother before him. Now, just because he didn't want that kind of lifestyle as his father had, that does not mean he lacked a sexual appetite. Oh no, he was fairly typical of the Stuart males in his family in this respect, except that he seems to have satiated his carnal needs with his wife, Henrietta Maria, who was a controversial consort because she was a French Catholic princess. And there's a whole lot of information there. And she remains to this day a very controversial figure. Now, the king's only known adulterous liaison took place with one Jane Horwood while he was imprisoned in Carisbrooke Castle in 1648. Now, Horwood was a devoted royalist spy who became Charles's follower, friend, and then mistress. It seems that she both physically and emotionally comforted an increasingly doom-laden monarch who by this time had been separated from his wife for more than 4 years. He had a strong sexual drive, as I mentioned earlier, and this brief sexual fling with Jane Horwood was what he needed. And he was then executed in early 1649. Next up, we have this fellow. His scepter and his prick are of a length, and she may sway the one who plays with the other. So wrote John Wilmot, the infamous second Earl of Rochester, about Charles II, popularly known as the Merry Monarch. Born on the 29th of May, 1630, Charles Stuart was the eldest surviving son of King Charles I and Henrietta Maria. Aged 14, Charles lost his virginity to Christabella Wyndham, a woman in her late 30s who had been both his wet nurse and one of his governesses until he was 5. Now you can imagine what Sigmund Freud would say about that. Later on, his lovers included Lucy Walter, Barbara Villiers, whose biography I'm currently writing. What a woman! Wow. Hortense Mancini, Nell Gwynn, Moll Davies, among many others. Although he sired many children with these mistresses, he had no children with his wife, Catherine of Braganza. Next up, we have James II of England and 7th of Scotland. And he reigned from 1685 to 1688, unless you are a Jacobite, and that 1688 is to his death, 1701, I believe. So he is quite different to his brother. He was in many respects the opposite of his saturnine eldest brother, Charles II, where Charles was dark-set and famously said of himself, "Odds fish, I am an ugly fellow." James was considered very handsome, with blue eyes. Where Charles had been fun-loving, James had come across as rather dour and humorless. But when it came to sex, however, he certainly had that famed Stuart appetite for carnal pleasures. As Gilbert Burnet put it, if I can find it, as Gilbert Burnet put it, the Duke was, even to his old age, of an amorous disposition. He was, according to the Count of Gramont, the most unguarded ogler of his time. Samuel Pepys was wary of him, because his own wife, Elizabeth, found herself on the receiving end of that steely, ogling gaze. James had two wives, Anne Hyde, with whom he had the daughters Mary, who later became Mary II, and Anne, who later became Queen Anne. His second wife was Mary of Modena, an Italian Catholic princess. James lost his throne during the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which his nephew, William of Orange, invaded at the request of 7 influential British statesmen. And here we have William and Mary. William and Mary were first cousins who were married in 1677 when Mary was 15 and William 27. The question of King William III's sexuality remains a contentious subject, and historians themselves are divided upon the matter. The couple certainly had sex, however, and Mary conceived at least twice, but suffered miscarriages. William was an intensely private individual, and he was very religious as well. So his sexual and therefore adulterous liaisons were not something of which he was proud. Furthermore, it was likely that the poor nature of his health, in particular his chronic asthma, his hemorrhoids, among other things, would have probably meant he suffered from a low sex drive compared to his other Stuart relatives. But when he was younger, when he was a teenager, and he visited his uncle's licentious court, his uncles got him so drunk that he ended up breaking into the apartments of the ladies in waiting, intent on having a sexual encounter with one of the women there, but he was pulled away before anything truly reprehensible happened. In vino veritas, as people say, he indicated that he was sexually attracted to women. William, unfortunately, had a mistress called Elizabeth Villiers, who was related to Barbara Villiers, who was Charles II's mistress. And she was his mistress for a long time. And William ultimately realized the depth of his love for his wife, Mary, and slept near her on a camp bed when she was dying of smallpox in December of 1694. And he stayed with her until the end because he just didn't want to miss a single moment of her remaining time here. Political strategy, personal ambition, and private sufferings, I mentioned previously, their miscarriages, had taken a toll upon their relationship, and William was in despair. Finally, Gilbert Burnet wrote that the normally cold king broke down in tears before him and cried out, "There is no hope of the queen," and that from the happiest he was now going to be the miserablest creature upon earth. William died in 1702, having never remarried. Okay, and here we have Queen Anne. Queen Anne reigned from 1702 to 1714, and with William dead, the throne passed to Anne, who was Mary's younger sister and William's former sister-in-law. She was overweight, shy, stubborn, short-sighted, with low self-esteem, and she had one of the most tragic gynecological histories of the entire Stuart family. She is also rumored to have been a lesbian, though in all probability, this is probably untrue. She loved her husband, Prince George of Denmark, very much, and the couple were both very sexually active with each other and very faithful, and they were both quite religious. Anne was best friends with Sarah Churchill, who was 5 years older than she was, and would become quite a dominant force over the princess. Anne, over time, was subjected to regular disrespectful treatment from her great old favorite. And it's not surprising that she eventually gravitated towards another person who was kinder to her, and that person was Abigail Hill, who later became Abigail Masham. And although she was a mere bedchamber woman, she increasingly provided a compassionate and deferential treatment that Anne needed. All of her life, Anne felt this desire to be loved. And you can tell that from all of the writings from the time. She was just crying out for someone to love her, and so she let Sarah take her under her wing from childhood, and she looked up at her with this sort of awe, but that faded away because she realized that this person's just unkind. So, but some researchers claim that Sarah Churchill had sexual relations with Queen Anne, but there is no evidence, only speculation to support this claim. Furthermore, it is not necessary to posit a motive of sexual jealousy in order to explain Sarah's actions. She could be extremely vindictive to those with whom she fell out, and she fell out with a good many people, including members of her own family, and for a variety of reasons. When Sarah died, further works were published about her. In 1746, verses upon the late Duchess of Marlborough came out, and they stated, quite understandably, given her behavior, that who breaks with her provokes revenge from hell. So I think that gives us a pretty clear view of how her behavior was. And in short, in conclusion, it took about 2.5 years of research and writing, but let me just stop share. There we go. Back. Okay. It took about 2 years of research and writing, but these were subjects that I have worked on for over a decade, and I felt honored to be able to do this work. I learned so much about our 17th and early 18th century ancestors, and I found their stories amusing, fascinating, romantic, horrifying, and sometimes heartbreaking. The main thing I learned was that despite all the struggles of life during the period, and with the exclusion of some of the stories I included in the book, that most precious of human emotions, love, was often in evidence, be it love for one's parents, lover, spouse, children. It's always there. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you ever so much for that talk.
Thank you.
I was going to say, if
Thank you so
anybody would like to ask any questions, at the bottom of your screen, you should have a reaction button, so you can do a thumbs up. And if you do a thumbs up, I can hopefully see you and be able to give you the option. So, Andrea,
let's see.
You happy?
Yep.
Is it Alina? I'm just going to ask you to unmute. So you should have an option to unmute now.
Yes. Hello, Andrea. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk.
Thank you.
I'm actually interested in the subject of how whether during your research you actually encountered any information about manifestation of sexuality in the court in court ceremonies, in particular in terms of dancing. Because this is something that I've been interested for quite a while. I wondered, so we do perceive dancing as a kind of in any way not sexual activity, but related to love. But was this perception evident in the 17th century? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think there's definitely a sort of seductive element, a sexual element when it comes to dancing, because you have two beings close in a sort of rhythmic movement, and I haven't done any research in particular on court dancing, but there is definitely that element of people dancing, and it's a physical, social, and it could be a romantic thing, to people getting together and doing a physical dance together. I do think that there's a great deal to look into that. That's a good thing to look into. Thank you.
Anybody else like to ask another question? See if the reactions button, if you do a thumbs up or a wave. Harry, should be able to unmute yourself now, Harry.
Hello, slight declaration of interest. Andrea has very kindly helped me with a number of elements I have in my own book set in the Stuart era, based on the Musketeers. So this is a question related to that. The lead character in my book falls in love with the very first woman he sees, but is a complete gentleman and knows he has to do a number of things. The first thing he does is he declares her love for her over a picnic by the River Seine. The next thing he does is say, when I'm able to, I will give you a ring. The third thing he does is write letters to her uncle saying, I have had extreme feelings for your niece for a long time. May I be permitted to marry her? Which he says, of course, you didn't really need to write because I feel like I know you anyway. The fourth thing he does is introduce a call tube. Now, could I ask, how prevalent was the call tube outside Puritan romance?
A call tube?
a call to, very much like a trumpet that was used to separate two people in the same way as a bundling board was.
Right. You know what? I actually haven't come across that. I've come across bundling, which I've mentioned in the book, but that's a new one on me. I've not come across that, so I'll have to get back to you on that. I'll look into that.
Well, the basic question is, therefore, were people during romances, during the courtship, kept apart by everyone bar the Puritans, or was it just a general feature?
People weren't really kept apart, but if they were courting, that would be bundling would be a part of that. Let me see. Let me just get something. I can find it. Let's see. Yeah, bundling. Yeah, it would usually involve a young man and woman sleeping in the same bed overnight, but they were well advanced in the courtship by then. But other family members would be sleeping in the same room, so that would they would have a board between them, and other people of the family would be in the same room. So that would generally put a stop to things. But as I said in the book, once the family members were asleep, I don't see why people wouldn't try something together. They would just move the board. And after all, I think Maureen Waller said that by 1700, 1 in 10 English brides was already with child by the time they got married. So I think for your book, I'll look into what you've mentioned. I'll write that, and I'll get back to you on that, because I have the details. Yeah, that's great. I'll do that. Yep. Okay. Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting. Okay.
Any other questions? Mike, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
There we go. Thank you. Can I just ask, you've kind of effectively divided the period into two halves with the interregnum in the middle. Was there a change in attitudes before and after the Commonwealth, effectively, or did business in terms of sexual mores, I suppose, just pick up exactly where it left off after the fall of Cromwell?
That's a very good question, and hello. I think that there was. I think that there was a period, the interregnum. I do regard it as being different from what happened before and after. It just they seem to really value sex in terms of inside wedlock, and I think that there was a lot of legal measures, laws passed during the 1650s to support their ideology of the time. In terms of whether it's different, I think yes, it was different. But I think that society and sexual mores, it's like a pendulum. I think I always see it as a swinging pendulum, and it moves. So James the First or the Sixth was quite, according to Lucy Hutchinson and others, quite debauched, and then Charles the First, very much the opposite, because he didn't like that, and even more so during the interregnum. It went all the way, and then it seems to have swung back completely the other way for Charles II. And then there was this pull again during William and Mary's reign, with I think it's the Reformation of Manners. Yeah, the the Reformation of manners, which happened in the late 17th century. And, but of course, at the same time, while there were these sweeping changes to try to hit back against the hedonistic excesses of the Restoration Court, you still see this rise in sort of this other sexual, there's this increase in sexual behavior in some respects. So I think you see that throughout history, that you have this staunch wave to stamp down on sexual behavior, and then you see it come back up with from below, and people, they just want to have a sort of, I don't know, it's a sort of hit back at that, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I was really interested. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. But I have
Thank
to
you.
say
I really
that,
hope you, yeah.
I have to say, so as somebody who works in IT, I really don't envy your Google search history.
Oh no, I hope nobody ever sees that. It's going to be terrible. Yes.
Thank you.
But thank you. I really hope you enjoy the book. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
I was going to say, unless anybody puts up a hand, I think we'll probably end it here. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you for your book. It's fascinating. It is so accessible, and it's made me look at the Stuarts in a slightly different way now. And I'm going to be searching for more dramas as well, docudramas. About the Stuarts, because I want to see more now. Yeah.
May I suggest the first Churchills? Oh boy, that's so good.
First Churchills. Okay, yep. Brilliant.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone who showed up today, and thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
And please don't forget, Andrea's book is available to buy. I was going to say Pen Sword are the publishers for this book, and you can buy directly from their website, or you can support an independent bookshop. Details on how to do so or to donate to the Wantage Literary Festival are available on our social media pages. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.